Mr. President,
I recognize the Majority Whip.
I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, when government wastes taxpayer money, taxpayers have a right to know what happened. And when emboldened criminals steal money intended to help single moms and children in need, taxpayers have a right to be angry. And Americans, and I'm hearing it in Wyoming, and I'm sure you're hearing it, Mr. President, your home state of Ohio, Americans are infuriated with the staggering amount of fraud unfolding today in the state of Minnesota. The past few weeks have shown just how deep the corruption in Minnesota has turned out to be. Investigators have now uncovered fraud schemes across 14 different Minnesota Medicaid programs. Most people don't even know there are 14 different Medicaid programs. There's fraud in all of them in Minnesota. Joe Thompson, who's U.S. Attorney in Minnesota, has spent his career prosecuting fraud. And based on his extensive investigation, he believes criminals have now stolen at least $9 billion with a B dollars from those Minnesota Medicaid programs. That is half of the total amount of money Minnesota spends for Medicaid programs in the state. Today, the fraud is so prevalent that Thompson says the state has developed a fraud tourism industry. Can you imagine that? A fraud tourism industry. Here's how these schemes work. Criminals, fraudsters, set up fake businesses for nonprofit organizations. The criminals then claim to provide services such as housing, food, and health care assistance. Then they bill Medicaid. And they bill them for services never provided. They use the names of children and enroll them into the programs. Sometimes the children don't exist, sometimes the children exist, and they're signed up by parents who are getting paid fraudulently to let them use their children's names. In 2021, taxpayers paid $4.6 million for something called Minnesota's Integrated Community Support Medicaid Program. It's a mouthful. 2021, $4.6 million. Then the fraudsters hit. 3 years later, due to criminal fraud, spending for that program ballooned to more than $170 million. From $4 million to $170 million, that's 37 times as much in just 3 years. Money completely stolen. As the governor and others in Minnesota, the Democrat elected officials looked the other way. Taxpayers similarly paid $21 million in 2021 for something called Minnesota's Housing Stabilization Services. The first 6 months of last year, due to criminal fraud, Democrats looking the other way, taxpayers paid nearly 3 times that amount. A Medicaid program claiming to help Minnesota children with autism, $6 million in 2018. By 2023, due to criminal fraud, it went from $6 million to $192 million. And daycare fraud is just one of these brazen schemes where the Democrats in Minnesota look the other way. Last month, an independent journalist visited 10 state-funded daycare sites in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul. He found no children at the daycare centers. Middle of the day, not a single child was there. 1 year ago, a local reporter visited several of those same sites. The reporter found no children at the daycare centers. They're supposed to be daycare centers, and they're getting paid to take care of children. Well, here's one of those sites, Mr. President. This is a sign from one of the states. It's called, who makes this? You can't make this stuff up. Quality Learning Center. It's supposed to be a learning center. They can't even spell learning right. But that doesn't stop the Democrats in Minnesota to keep shoveling money right to these programs, stealing money from the taxpayers, from the Democrats, gone to Democrats who are running these things. Mr. President, it's appalling. The people of the United States are appalled and are furious. This ought to be a red flag for fraud. Why aren't the Democrats who run the place doing anything about it? There were 95 violations for this Leering Center alone between 2019 and 2023. Violations occurred, no records on the children. But in Minnesota, run by the Democrats, taxpayer money continued to flow. It's disgraceful, Mr. President. These aren't just one-off abuses. We now know that the fraud schemes used in the state's child care programs have been used to defraud other social programs as well. Even the New York Times has pointed to this. They say the fraud in Minnesota, run by the Democrats, is, quote, staggering in its scale and brazenness. I don't see any Democrats coming to the floor here today to point out the fraud, talk about what's happening there, how the money's been stolen from people that need it, the services that are needed by people. That means they're not getting it. The Department of Justice has charged 98 defendants in Minnesota Medicaid fraud-related cases. So far, 64 of these have been convicted. Last month, one defendant was found guilty of stealing $14 million from Medicaid. Yes, she did. She stole $14 million from Medicaid. You don't hear a word from the Minnesota Democrats coming to the floor here to talk about it. Nope. She also stole nearly $500,000 from child nutrition programs. You hear the Democrats coming to the floor and say, oh, we need more money for child nutrition, more money for child health care. Why aren't they looking at where the money is being taken from the mouths of the children? For fraudsters, what was done, how much money was taken? Let's put this into perspective. The stolen money was supposed to be used to provide 200,000 meals for hungry children who did not get fed. Democrats must think that's fine. The defendant instead sent the hundreds of thousands of dollars overseas, and she bought real estate in Kenya, in Africa. Apparently, that's how business goes in Minnesota with the Democrats who are running that state. This organized systemic theft has gone on for years under Democrat leadership, and it really exploded under Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. The Democrats have permitted schemes stacked upon schemes to drain money meant for those in need. Republicans are not going to allow this massive theft of taxpayer dollars to be ignored. Democrats want us to just look the other way. We are talking about a comprehensive approach to root out the fraud in Minnesota and across the country. Now, our Working Families Tax Cut law fights fraud. We strengthened eligibility requirements for Medicaid. We ensured that illegal immigrants don't receive taxpayer-funded health care. We put in place work requirements for Medicaid and for food stamps. These policies will protect taxpayers and will increase accountability. Additionally, Republicans are conducting aggressive congressional oversight. On Friday, the entire Senate Republican conference demanded Governor Walz explain his actions. We asked 9 specific, detailed questions. Questions such as why Minnesota failed to adopt key fraud prevention measures. Why aren't they trying to prevent the fraud? Why do they keep looking the other way? These are measures that the Department of Health and Human Services recommended to Minnesota back in May. Nope, Governor Walz, nothing to do with it. He knew about this widespread fraud. He refused to do anything about it. Senate Republicans are ready to give the Trump administration the manpower it needs to tackle this fraud in Minnesota and wherever else it appears and occurs. Now, the Trump administration has asked the Senate to confirm a new Assistant Attorney General position, a position that will be focused on the fraud. And the Senate will get that person in place and on the job quickly, Mr. President. The Trump administration has taken other bold and decisive actions to stop fraud. To further strengthen enforcement efforts, the Department of Justice has doubled the number of attorneys handling these fraud cases. The Treasury Department is cracking down on businesses in Minnesota for alleged money laundering, because that's what's happening. The Department of Health and Human Services under President Trump froze federal funding for fraud-prone programs in Minnesota. If Senate Democrats cared about stopping fraud, why are they preparing to vote today to loosen eligibility and income verifications for Obamacare subsidies? They ought to want to be tightening these things up. But that's what the Congressional Review Act resolution from Democrat Senator Mark Warner of Virginia does, and we're going to vote on it today. Eliminating these vital protections invites more fraud. It means subsidies go to individuals who don't qualify for them. Congress shouldn't make it easier to defraud the American taxpayers. This is a wrong direction to take after the biggest fraud scandal in Minnesota history. Protecting taxpayer dollars should not be a partisan issue. The fraud scandal in Minnesota should be a wake-up call for every American taxpayer. Our federal government spends nearly $1.5 trillion each and every year to try to help feed and house and treat and care for vulnerable families and children. Those programs are there for a reason. The Democrats seem to be a piggy bank for people who want to steal from the government. Medicaid, food stamps, and other social programs have been called a lifeline. Years of waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption have pushed those who truly need the help away from the lifeline and to the back of the line. That's what Democrats have been enabling and continue to enable. Republicans aren't going to stop until the depth of this fraud is uncovered and prosecuted. And Republicans are committed to preventing it from happening again. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President.
I recognize the Democrat whip.
Mr. President, it has been my good fortune and honor to serve in this chamber for many years and to represent my home state of Illinois. I could reflect for a moment about the changes in the Senate chamber in the time that I have been here. I'm afraid it would take me too long to express my thoughts on that at the expense of the regular business of this chamber. But we have reached a point where there are few and far between moments when we come together and agree on something the American people think is important. A year ago, I was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee for 4 years. We considered many judicial nominees and many pieces of legislation in that committee. We were evenly divided or closely divided during the entire period of time. I think we achieved quite a few things despite those divisions. We approved more judicial nominees for federal judgeships in that 4-year period of time than any 4-year period in the history of the United States Senate. It took 80% of the votes to be bipartisan for that to happen. So I tried as chairman to always find something that we just might agree on. Democrats and Republicans would agree. The issue which I'm going to address very briefly this morning is one of those issues. There was a time when the Senate Judiciary Committee was so equally and evenly divided that people thought we would accomplish nothing. But there came an issue where there was a consensus among Democrats and Republicans. And it's one that every parent and grandparent, I think every individual will understand. Have you seen your kids or grandkids lately? Have you noticed what they're doing? They're looking at this virtually all day long if you let them. It's a concern for many conscientious parents that what is being broadcast on those cell phones could be life-altering and changing for young people. And that's one of the issues I will address this morning. You see, during the period of time when I chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee, we considered the negative impact that these cell phones and laptops have on children. It's frightening. Parents came and testified before us that their kids, normal, happy, productive, good students in a short period of time were captivated by laptops and cell phones into changes in attitude, changes in conduct. Sadly, some of the children took their own lives because of their exposure to what happened on these devices. It's heartbreaking. I recall one in particular, a young African-American high school student, a track star at his school, who got swept into some sort of a broadcast on social media, and in a span of 19 hours became so despondent and excited and emotional, he harmed himself and took his own life. The parents couldn't understand it. They didn't see it coming. And when they reflected on what was being done, it was an outrage. There's another thing going on which everyone should be aware of. And if you look closely on television, you might just spot warnings. It's this whole issue of deepfakes, AI, taking what looks to be real and broadcasting it as reality when in fact it's not. Last Congress, we considered a measure which I introduced and would like to ask for passage today. There will be a unanimous consent request made at the end of my statement. If that unanimous consent request passes, and I hope it does, with bipartisan support, it will go to the House of Representatives for their consideration. It'll be miraculous. We just might pass a bill. We just might create a law. Stay tuned. Let me tell you what it's all about. I rise today to ask the Senate to pass the DEFIANCE Act, bipartisan legislation that gives victims of non-consensual, sexually explicit deepfakes the tools to fight back against those who would exploit them. I want to thank the Senate sponsors of this legislation, including my Republican co-lead, Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina. I told you it was bipartisan. It is. I've been proud to partner with a person I don't know well on a personal basis, but I certainly have seen her work. Her name is Representative Ocasio-Cortez. She represents the city of New York. She introduced legislation in the House with 7 Republicans and 6 Democratic co-sponsors. So her measure was bipartisan as it passed the House of Representatives. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez herself is a publicly confessed and admitted victim of explicit deepfakes. I commend her for working to create tools for victims in the fight against despicable crime. She has been an innocent victim, and she's spoken out on it to spare others what she's been through. In 2025, the Take It Down Act was signed into law. This bipartisan legislation makes it a federal crime to knowingly publish or threaten to publish non-consensual, intimate images on social media. The DEFIANCE Act, which provides victims with a civil remedy, a remedy in court, builds on the progress of the Take It Down Act. The vast majority of American people support prohibiting non-consensual, sexually explicit deepfake images, with one survey finding that 85% of Republicans and Democrats support this measure. That's why I'm hopeful it will pass today and be considered favorably by the House. And that's why last Congress, the Senate unanimously passed this measure. We didn't get it done then, we're returning to it now. The Senate should pass this bill again, and the House should take it up quickly, as the problem of non-consensual, sexually explicit deepfake images continues to spread. With the push of a button, generative AI can swap someone's face onto another person's body, remove that person's clothing so they appear nude, or undress someone to show them in lingerie or other exposed positions. Recent reporting detailed how users of X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, can ask its AI chatbot, Grok, G-R-O-K, Grok, to undress women and underage girls in photos. Grok will comply with requests to show subjects in undress, various states of undress, with images which I won't repeat for the record, but they're horrible. Even after these reports, X still has not prevented Grok from creating these exploitive images. Let me make sure you understand what I just said. Even after these terrible, deepfake, harming images are pointed out to Grok and to X, formerly Twitter, they do not respond. They don't take the images off the internet. They don't come to the rescue of the people who are victims. That's why this legislation is critical, because this legislation says if they are guilty of such reckless misconduct that they can be sued for it and held civilly liable for the damages. Imagine losing control of your own likeness and identity. Imagine that happening to you when you were in high school. Imagine how powerless victims feel when they cannot remove illicit content, cannot prevent it from being reproduced repeatedly, and cannot prevent new images from being created. The consequences can be profound. Victims may endure threats to their employment, education, or reputation, or suffer additional criminal activity such as extortion and stalking. Many experience depression, anxiety, and fear being in public, and in worst cases, victims have been driven to suicide. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez has described her own reaction to being depicted in this way, without her consent. She said, and I quote, "There is a shock to seeing images of yourself that someone could think are real." While prominent women are often the target for non-consensual sexual explicit deepfakes, sadly, the victims can be virtually anyone. There are distressing reports of middle and high school students struggling to respond to this crisis. In March 2024, at least 22 students at a high school in McHenry County in my home state of Illinois learned they were depicted in deepfakes circulating online. One of the images was a doctored version of a photo of two female students taken at the school prom. I will not describe in detail what that deepfake did, but it had to be crushing for these young women and their families. Sadly, we are seeing an explosion of these images. One researcher found that the number of non-consensual pornographic deepfake videos available online has increased 900%. 900% since 2019. Such videos have been viewed by almost 4 billion times. 4 billion. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the number of AI-generated child sex abuse images increased from 5,000 in 2023 to over 485,000 in the first 6 months of 2025. Tragically, currently, victims have no civil legal remedy to pursue justice. The DEFIANCE Act changes that and gives to victims their day in court. The bill would permit victims to bring a civil case against those who produce, disclose, solicit, or possess with intent to disclose sexually explicit deepfakes, while knowingly or recklessly disregarding that the person depicted did not consent to the conduct. I am proud to have collaborated with survivor advocates on this bill. Their lived experience and leadership have shaped this legislation. Congress needs to act. It is past time to give victims of non-consensual sexually explicit deepfakes the tools they need to fight back. I'm now going to make a unanimous consent request on this bipartisan legislation. Senator Graham could not join me on the floor today, but he is a co-sponsor and supportive of this bipartisan bill. I'll make the following unanimous consent. Notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of S-1837 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
S-1837, a bill to improve rights to relief for individuals affected by non-consensual activities involving intimate digital forgeries and for other purposes.
Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Mr. President, it feels good. It feels good to see the Senate actually passing legislation. It's rare, it doesn't happen a lot. And on a measure of this importance, it's critically important that we come together, both political parties. I want to thank Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez for her leadership on this issue, her bravery on this issue throughout this debate. And now let's pass this in the House and make it the law of the land. Give to the victims their day in court to hold those responsible who continue to publish these images at their expense. The Senate has voted to unanimously pass this important legislation. The victims of this horrible crime deserve this day in court, and today we are one step closer to making that a reality. I yield the floor.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, sometimes in Washington you feel like there's nothing anyone can agree on, but one thing we can all agree on, no matter what your party, is that health care is too expensive. I'm a doctor who worked in the hospital, public hospital system for the working uninsured and the poorly insured. And it's not just the poor, it's also middle-income Americans who have a really hard time right now of affording their health care. Now, it's a little bit of an irony here. Obamacare came into existence, and it was supposed to decrease premiums by $2,400 a year. And since then, premiums have probably risen, I don't know, in the aggregate, 100% since that law was passed. And part of this is waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars. So we're paying higher premiums, and the taxpayer's getting ripped off as well. Just some recent examples. In November, a federal jury in West Palm Beach convicted 2 individuals in a $233 million Obamacare fraudulent enrollment scheme. Earlier this year, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services identified 2.8 million duplicate enrollments across Medicaid and Obamacare, which waste an estimated $14 billion annually. And just a few weeks ago, the Government Accountability Office released a report highlighting likely significant fraud in the Obamacare marketplaces due to lack of proper verification. In this, by the way, the GAO put up shoddy data on purpose to see if it would be accepted, and it was accepted across the board, even though they came nowhere close to providing the information they were supposed to provide. Now, the American people want lower health care costs, and they also want us to protect their taxpayer dollar from fraud and abuse. So, we need a health care system that protects patients and families, but doesn't reward a get-rich-quick by any means fraudster looking to get an extra buck from the federal taxpayer. That's why Republicans have focused on a way forward on health care that actually lowers costs, fights fraud, and gives power to the patient, not profit to the insurance company, not ill-gotten gains to the criminal. Now, my Democratic colleagues are about to put up a resolution, which would do a Congressional Review Act on a recent rule put out by the administration to fight waste, fraud, and abuse. For whatever reason, this resolution wants to fighting waste, fraud, and abuse. And if the CRA passes, it'll eliminate common sense measures for waste, fraud, and abuse, to eliminate them, to at least address them, as well as safeguards ensuring that subsidies go to patients who qualify, those who need it to afford coverage. By the way, the resolution being offered by my Democratic colleagues will raise insurance premiums by 5%. They're offering a CRA that raises premiums the effect of by 5%. That's money that a family could use to pay their car note, their flood insurance note, their grocery bill, you name it, rent for their apartment, and instead it's going to insurance companies. Now, I don't quite know why my Democratic colleagues are so entrenched in protecting a broken system. They are willing to raise premiums 5% to protect the status quo. Now, as I said, I'm a doctor who worked in the public hospital system for over 20 years, trying to bring health care to people who otherwise couldn't afford. Let's work together. Let's find a solution that actually lowers costs, doesn't increase premiums. Let's find a solution which squeezes out waste, which eliminates and prosecutes fraud, not a system in which they are rewarded. So, as a doctor, as a conservative, as an American, as a steward of when I say federal taxpayer, I mean you and me and everybody watching and everyone in the gallery. Let's steward that money correctly. I urge my colleagues to reject this resolution and continue with bipartisan, important work to make health care more affordable. With that, I yield.
Senator Virginia.
Mr. President, I move to proceed to calendar number 293 SJ Res 84.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 293, SJ Res 84, joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code, and so forth.
Mr. President, I rise today. I'm sorry, Mr. President, are we in a quorum? We're not in a
We are not.
Okay, so I'm going to proceed. Mr. President, I rise today because I think it is painfully clear that we need to do something to address the growing healthcare crisis in this country. Let me be clear at the outset, what I'm going to talk about now is a CRA that the clerk just reported. It is not directly related, it is not the tax credit issue that has been a subject of an enormous amount of other debate and frankly, action in the House, but a CRA that will be voted on later today that will overturn a rule that this administration has put forward, the Trump administration put forward, that will result in 1.8 million Americans being thrown off their health insurance. Now, this is beyond the tax credit issue, it's beyond the Medicaid changes. This is a rule that the administration set forward last year that adds enormous amounts of regulatory burden for any American who chooses to access the so-called Obamacare marketplace. And the truth is, this administration's attack on the marketplace, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, didn't start with this rule. As we all know in this chamber, this is just another step in a now close to 15-year crusade by many of my Republican colleagues to undermine the ACA, which at the end of the day is just going to, as we've seen already, is going to increase health care costs for everybody. We know at the end of last year, as the expiration of the ACA enhanced premium tax credits approached, Democrats in Congress worked hard to try to extend them. We put forward a strong compromise proposal to extend the credits and keep health insurance affordable for the close to 24 million Americans who access their health care through the marketplace. Unfortunately, time and again, Republicans voted against it, ensuring that when the clock struck midnight on January 1, millions of Americans were priced out of that coverage. Families across the country have now been hit with premium increases of $800, $900, and even over $1,000 just per month. We talk about somebody in my state, in Virginia, Kathleen, a mother of two and a small business owner living in Newport News, saw her premium for her family of four increase from $544 a month to over $1,500 a month. That's a yearly increase of about $11,500 a year, a price tag that her family just can't afford. She told me as she came up to the Hill before New Year's hit that she hoped and prayed for a solution. I think, frankly, I wish all of my Republican colleagues who helped block that solution could have explained to her why blocking that solution, which we offered as a straightforward extension of the ACA premium tax credits, why they blocked that, because Kathleen and so many other families desperately needed it. I will have to say I got to give some rare congratulations to at least 17 members of the House, Republican members of the House, which had actually taken action recently to address this crisis. 17 House Republicans finally said enough and voted with Democrats in the House to extend the credits, which will again lower the cost for millions. I hope that we can get a similar type of compromise through in the Senate. I know there are colleagues on both sides of the aisle working hard on that issue right now. And while the credits have taken up most of the space around the debate, what I rise today on the CRA that will be voted on this afternoon will provide even more immediate solution to at least take away another barrier to healthcare accessibility and affordability. I'm asking my colleagues, and I'll be joined by other colleagues to talk about this over the next hour or so, I'm asking my colleagues to join me in disapproving of a harmful rule that the Trump administration finalized last year that was set to kick in at the end of 2025. And as I mentioned, that would take off about 1.8 million to 2 million people off their health care because of the enormous administrative burdens that are put in place by this administrative rule to try to get access to the marketplace. This is at least a chance today, not at some future date, to come together to do the bare minimum and address at least a small part of the emergency straining our healthcare system. Now, I will acknowledge that because this administrative burden was so burdensome, the courts have paused its enactment, but at any moment, that pause could be taken away. So let's just use the CRA, which has been used by both sides of the aisle repeatedly, to get rid of this additional burden. Because simply put, this harmful Trump rule makes it harder to enroll in a marketplace plan, harder to stay on a marketplace plan, and harder and more expensive for states to run a marketplace. The rule requires increased paperwork for families, reduces open and special enrollment periods, and allows insurers to push more health care costs on Americans by allowing plans to cover less care. It also adds a ton more paperwork and burdens on the marketplaces all across the country. And again, according to the Trump administration's own document, these added barriers and higher premiums will lose to that estimate of at least 1.8 million people losing coverage. If this rule, which is again scheduled to go into effect, but has only not gone into effect in 2026 because of a current pause by the courts. But I think we ought to avoid this cliff and just act today as the Senate and say, let's not have this rule take effect. I think most of us would agree that 2025 was not a great year for health care in this country. Medicaid cuts, which are going to be enormous, which frankly were not scheduled to kick in until after the 2026 elections, interestingly enough, although I can tell you we've already seen rural health care clinics close in Virginia because of that expectation. My colleagues' refusal to extend the enhanced premium tax credits are all weighing down on our health care system. And we're seeing, particularly rural hospitals and rural health care centers, really bear the brunt of this. The truth is the Trump administration and congressional Republicans have jammed through health care policies that combine the rule, the tax premiums, minimum looks like about 15 million Americans will get kicked off their health insurance. So let's go back. My Republican colleagues and the president won in 2024 because they're going to lower costs. Well, we can actually take action on lowering costs today. So let's join together, use the CRA tool, and end this policy. All you have to do is vote for the Congressional Review Act resolution, making sure, again, the number, not my number, the Trump administration's number, meaning that 1.8 million Americans will actually get to keep their health care. All you have to do is vote for this CRA resolution so that folks don't have to deal with enormously burdensome paperwork and the higher costs that result. Now, I think we can get this done. We've seen my Republican colleagues stand up to the president on the Epstein files, on war powers, and just in the last day or so, the attack on the independence of the Federal Reserve. Let's have that pushback extend now to healthcare costs. Let's help keep millions keep their health care today, and then work together towards a long-term sustainable plan to keep health care costs stable for the next decade. Before I yield the floor, I want to also acknowledge this is something that a lot of us have been working on. Senator Klobuchar, who does such a great job on so many issues, Senator Wyden, who's our leader on the Finance Committee. They and others will come today to speak on this issue as well. I hope my colleagues are listening, and I hope they will actually acknowledge we got to bring healthcare costs down today. This isn't a full solution, but at least it's an action that we can take today. So with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I want to thank Senator Warner for his tremendous leadership on this important issue that is just really tormenting so many Americans right now, as well as Senator Wyden. This involves tens of millions of Americans who are facing a health care crisis. Their premiums are doubling or tripling, and it is completely in our hands to do something about it. Open enrollment is ending in 2 days. Americans across the country are looking at their budgets and facing this difficult choice of whether to pay double or triple for coverage or go uninsured. And why are tens of millions of Americans facing this reality? Well, because congressional Republicans failed to act, to come to the table, to negotiate an extension of the Enhanced Affordable Care Act tax credits before the end of last year. Last Thursday, the House passed legislation to extend these health care tax credits for 3 years. 17 Republicans joined Democrats. You think about it, they could have done that months ago. Months ago. We were willing to negotiate with them 3 years, 2 years, 1 year at the time. They wouldn't do anything. And now they've realized, I guess they didn't understand what was happening to their constituents when 20-some% of farmers and ranchers are on these kinds of policies, and 75% of them are in red states. This legislation that Senator Warner and Wyden have proposed is simple and reasonable. We're simply saying let's make sure the same tax credits that make care more accessible for tens of millions of Americans yesterday and last year and the year before that continue to be there for families this year. Americans are looking for us to act, and the time to act is now. I've heard from people across my state in what is a very, very difficult time right now in the state of Minnesota, with the arrival of ICE on our streets, with people terrified, with the chaos that has ensued. We are still hearing from people about health care all the time. Nikki from Waseca wrote to me that the health care premium for her and her husband almost tripled from $862 a month to $2,344, which over the course of the year is more than her annual salary. She called the increase insufferable. Nadine from Sartell, a 53-year-old single mom, shared that she has a master's degree in social work but lives nearly paycheck to paycheck now because her housing and utility costs eat up over half of her monthly income. And unless Congress renews the health care tax credits, she's not going to be able to purchase health care. Of course, there's only 2 days left. And here's the kicker. Just 4 months ago, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She's already used up nearly all she has in savings for the copays and coinsurance to get a diagnosis and receive treatment. Another constituent, a school bus driver named David, saw his premiums double. He's now spending 12% of his total pre-tax income on health insurance. David wrote that it's difficult and frustrating to see life crumble before your eyes, just trying to get ahead and just to find setbacks waiting for you. I would like Congress to actually sit in real life people's shoes for just a while to see how it feels. I hope we can get something changed. That is a bus driver in Minnesota begging our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to stand and sit in his shoes. Because if Congress can't fix this, David shared with me that even though he works full-time, he will have to give up his health insurance entirely. The rules that Senator Warner and Senator Wyden and others of us have suggested do away with the caps that limit how much of their income people like David must spend on health insurance. And so as we work to extend the health care tax credits, it's critical that we stop the administration from further undermining the Affordable Care Act and raising costs. And this just isn't happening in my state, as I know 3/4 of the people who get their health coverage on this ACA marketplace live in states that President Trump won. We know the stakes, and we must come together to solve this affordability crisis. And I will note that the amount of money given to Argentina was approximately the same amount it would take to fix this for 1 year. There's a lot more work to be done to lower health care costs. Medicare price drug negotiations that I have led for years and making sure that's really happening under this administration, reforming prior authorization, making improvements, public option, we go on and on and on. But right now, we have one crisis that is hitting so many Americans, and we have a way to fix it. So I urge my Republican colleagues to join us to stop Americans' health care premiums from skyrocketing and simply bring to the Senate floor and pass the bipartisan House-passed bill to extend the health care tax credits that Americans rely on, and of course, to vote for SJ Resolution 84, which is in front of us today, and we thank Senator Warner and Wyden for leading the effort. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President,
Senator Morgan.
before she leaves the floor, I just want to say that the senator from Minnesota has been relentless in terms of standing up for folks who are just trying to get a fair shake on their premiums. I've been doing this since my days with the Gray Panthers, and I know what it means to be persistent. That defines Senator Klobuchar, and I thank her. I'm pleased to be working with Senator Warner and Senator Ossoff. I see Senator Kaine here, because all of us want to make sure we lower health care costs for American families. Today, the Senate's going to vote to repeal a host of damaging policies that Donald Trump, Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Oz have unleashed on Americans who are unsuspecting. People who are just trying to get by in tough times are going to get hammered. And from the day Donald Trump was sworn in, this administration made attacking Americans' health care their top priority. Last summer, Republicans in Congress rammed through a massive bill to give tax breaks to billionaires and giant corporations while making the largest health care cuts in American history. At the same time, the Trump administration used the Byzantine federal rulemaking process to double down on these efforts by finalizing the rule that all of us on this side of the aisle are working to repeal today. The harmful changes made by the Trump administration come down to one proposition. It's okay to have more red tape, and it's just fine to increase health care costs. That's the exact opposite of our agenda, which is to focus on affordability and making the American health care system simpler. I'm going to just tick through a couple of the worst examples to illustrate why these rules need to be junked. First, the Trump rules will increase what American families have to pay out of pocket each year by nearly $1,000. So the question becomes, Mr. President, what's the purpose behind that change other than to take money from Americans who are already struggling? The rule adds new fees, such as the new re-enrollment fee that applies to low-income workers. To be clear, that means if you want to keep your health insurance, you got to pay a fee to the government just for the right to keep what you've got. Even by Washington, D.C. standards, I say to my friend from Montana, that just defies common sense. They also create mandatory minimum premiums that are going to cause millions to lose their coverage. Now, Republicans say that these fees are aimed at reducing fraud. There's just no evidence to back it up. My view has been, ever since my days with the Gray Panthers, and my friend from Virginia knows about this, I say any fraud is too much. But the numbers are clear. The vast majority of fraud in health care is conducted by shady insurance brokers who are looking to make a fast buck through commissions from phony enrollments, not working Americans looking to buy health care. So I've introduced legislation to create tough criminal penalties for these insurance brokers. So make no mistake about it, Senator Kaine, there's something we ought to be doing to root out fraud. Let's go after these insurance brokers with tough criminal penalties. I've been talking to Republicans to ask them to join as co-sponsors, and they haven't been willing really to give us the time of day. Instead of going after fraud where it exists, Donald Trump and Republicans create barriers that are going to trip up Americans trying to navigate a health care system that's just too complicated. Beyond fees and higher premiums, the Trump rule also adds new verification checks and enrollment rules that amount to an enormous heap of red tape. These red tape measures, according to authorities who've analyzed it, is going to create 15 million hours of paperwork. 1.8 million people are going to lose their coverage as they try to navigate this never land of a maze of healthcare rules. These types of changes are right out of the playbook of big insurance because they create barriers and bureaucratic hurdles so they keep more of your money while denying working families basic health care. It's no secret that Americans have had a belly full of a health care system that gets in their way at every turn. It's time for Republicans to do the right thing and join with Democrats to lower Americans' health care costs instead of creating new cost barriers and red tape restrictions. They can help those families by voting with us today. I urge my colleagues to support Senator Warner and Senator Ossoff, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Kaine. We're all here for one purpose: less bureaucracy, less red tape, lowering premiums for families. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator Virginia.
Mr. President, I'm glad to join my colleagues to talk about the upcoming vote on Senate Joint Resolution 84, the use of the Congressional Review Act to strike down a recent regulatory attack on the Affordable Care Act launched by the Trump administration. I think my colleagues have done a pretty good job of explaining what's at stake. Even the Trump administration's own experts at CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, say that implementation of this rule could lead up to 1.8 million people to lose health insurance just this year, 2026. That would be devastating. On top of the premium increases that people have seen because the Affordable Care Act extended tax credits were not extended when tax cuts for the wealthiest were extended, this additional burden on this 1.8 million person population is unacceptable. And the vote we'll cast today gives us all an opportunity to sort of shore up the healthcare network for that nearly 2 million people. I wanted to focus in particular on a kind of person who is really going to be affected by the Trump rule if we do not affirmatively embrace this Congressional Review Act resolution, and that is self-employed entrepreneurs and gig workers. You know, one of the challenges about the American healthcare system before the Affordable Care Act was it was very, very difficult to buy health insurance if you were an individual entrepreneur, if you had a very small business. Without exchanges and the offering of policies on the exchanges with premium support for those who were lower middle income, you had a lot of people who were self-employed or entrepreneurs who couldn't buy insurance at all. And then you also had a huge group of people working with companies that had insurance that had this great American dream of an idea to start their own business, but they couldn't do it because if they were to leave their large employer to go off and follow their dream, they couldn't get health insurance. And one of the very salutary effects of the ACA through the creation of exchanges with premium support has been to enable people to pursue their dream and become innovators or entrepreneurs or gig workers and work in the way and in the flexible circumstance they choose. And Mr. President, I speak from experience because 2 of my 3 kids fit into this category. The rule that has been put in place by the Trump administration isn't going to make it particularly hard for large group plans to just re-up insurance, but it will make it very hard for those individuals that don't have an HR department fighting for them, that have to figure it out all on their own. It will make it very hard for them to negotiate the marketplace and buy insurance. And sometimes their income is up, and sometimes their income is down, and sometimes they want to enroll, and at other times they don't. It's precisely this kind of person that is going to be hit the hardest by the Trump rule, and why I'm so strongly in support of my colleagues' efforts to repeal it. You know, we often say, Mr. President, I'll conclude, that small businesses and startups are the backbones of the American economy, and they are. I grew up in a house with a dad who worked for a huge company, and it was his dream to start his own business. And he bought a little ironworking shop that at the time that he bought it had like 4 employees. And during the entire growing up period where I worked in my dad's shop, in a good year it would be 7 employees, and in a bad year it would be 4, plus my mom and my 2 brothers and me. So many American businesses are just like this. they're one or two employees. There's somebody who even has another gig, maybe as an artist, and they're moonlighting in some area where they can make just enough to afford to buy health insurance on the exchange if we don't crush them with high premiums and if we don't make the paperwork burdens so substantial. The CRA that my colleagues are offering will be directly responsive to the needs of this very, very important group of American innovators and entrepreneurs. And that's why I so strongly support it and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you.
Senator from Virginia. I note the absence of quorum. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Texas.
I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have two requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They've been approved by both the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, my Republican colleagues and I have spent a great deal of time this Congress focused on securing justice for victims of crimes committed by illegal aliens. Unfortunately, during the last administration, the Biden administration was completely, what I would call willfully blind to the threat that posed by people coming unvetted across our borders. From Laken Riley to Kayla Hamilton to Jocelyn Nungare, the victims of illegal aliens are numerous, but they must not be forgotten. What makes these tragedies so heartbreaking is the knowledge that many of these victims could have lived but for the Biden administration's open border policies and its failure to act responsibly and enforce the law. These good Americans died at the hands of criminal aliens who should never have set foot in our country. But there's another category of illegal alien criminals who are perhaps not so widely known, largely because the mainstream media outlets refuse to report on the many heinous crimes committed by illegal aliens each year. These are individuals who've endangered Americans by drunk driving. Every 42 minutes, someone dies in a crash involving alcohol. And as we've seen in the news, many of these crashes have been caused by illegal aliens who jeopardize the safety of law-abiding Americans. They've killed or severely maimed U.S. citizens and other lawful residents, depriving families of their loved ones and causing untold human misery. Some of these aliens have driven with expired licenses, suspended licenses, or no license at all, and have shown complete disregard for the danger that they pose. Last January, 2 college students in Illinois named Katie Abraham and Chloe Polzin were killed in a hit-and-run crash involving an illegal alien who was drunk driving. Their killer, an illegal alien from Guatemala, was charged with leaving the scene of the crash, resulting in death, aggravated driving under the influence of alcohol, and reckless homicide. Last October, Secretary Noem highlighted more than 140 illegal alien truck drivers who were arrested in Northwest Indiana during Operation Midway Blitz. These aliens were found guilty of numerous crimes, including driving under the influence, drug trafficking, theft, burglary, assault, child abuse, domestic battery, prostitution, and fraud. More than 40 of them had been issued a commercial driver's license by states like California, Illinois, and New York. It's clear that these states are not conducting due diligence if they're issuing commercial driver's licenses to illegal aliens who threaten the safety of American citizens on their roads and highways. Of course, Texans have not been spared the harm committed by such aliens, as we saw in the case of Arturo Cruz Badillo. Cruz Badillo is a Mexican national who had seven DWI convictions, a conviction for battery, and was removed from the United States 3 separate times. But despite all of these criminal convictions and removal for illegal entry in the United States, he was once again found re-entering illegally last August, hiding in a commercial cargo trailer. He was sentenced to jail earlier this year for his crimes. On top of the revolving door of removals because of how different states treat DUI and DWI offenses, some aliens are convicted multiple times but never removed from the United States. As recently as last month, ICE arrested 118 illegal aliens in California, including pedophiles, burglars, domestic abusers, and serial drunk drivers. One of these offenders had 4 separate DUI convictions, including one that caused bodily injury. He was also convicted of driving with a suspended driver's license. Another was convicted of a DUI, a hit and run, and driving without a license. Yet another was convicted of causing injury to a child, a hit and run causing property damage, and 2 DUIs, driving under the influence. Finally, one of these criminals was convicted of DUI causing great bodily injury, a hit and run causing property damage, and a separate DUI. Mr. President, considering how devastating a car accident can be, even if there are no physical injuries, these accidents caused not only bodily injury, but property damage to a person's car, and it must either be repaired or replaced, often costing hundreds or even thousands of dollars. And in the case of a hit and run, the situation is even more difficult because the victim cannot get the insurance information, if it exists, from the driver at fault in order to have the damage paid for. For the 1 in 4 American households who live paycheck to paycheck, an unexpected car accident might mean having to choose between repairing their car or paying their rent. Of course, if the driver at fault is an illegal alien, it's more likely to be a hit and run because they don't want to be detained or deported. And even if they're caught, they're not likely to have insurance. As a father of 2 daughters, I believe the danger that illegal aliens pose to the safety of Americans is simply unacceptable. It ought to be unacceptable to all of us and not tolerated. For this reason, I'm introducing the Stop Illegal Aliens Drunk Driving Act to address this discrepancy in federal law, where these DUIs, repetitive driving under the influence, driving while intoxicated, are simply winked at or ignored. This bill would make DUI and DWI offenses that result in death or bodily injury an aggravated felony under the Immigration and Nationality Act. What that means, aggravated felons are subject to mandatory detention. They're also ineligible for most immigration benefits. Furthermore, this bill would ensure that any illegal alien removed from the United States as an aggravated felon due to a DUI or DWI who attempts to re-enter illegally is subject to a penalty of up to 20 years in prison. Americans deserve to be safe while driving on our roads. Parents should not have to worry when they give their 16-year-old the keys to the car and learn how to drive or just get their first driver's license. They shouldn't have to worry whether an illegal alien driving under the influence of alcohol is going to cause them bodily harm or kill them outright. We simply cannot continue the status quo of allowing aliens who entered our country illegally or were allowed by the Biden administration's open border policies and who decide to drive drunk or under the influence. We can't allow them to continue to endanger the American public in this way. For this reason, I hope all of my colleagues will join me and support the Stop Illegal Aliens Drunk Driving Act. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to be able to complete my remarks before the scheduled recess.
Without objection.
Thank you. Well, I rise today because this president is poised to strip away health care from American families again. If Congress doesn't act to pass this measure, Americans will be forced to jump through more hoops just to get health insurance, and 1.8 million Americans will lose their coverage. This is just more of the same from Republicans and the president. Donald Trump and Republicans have spent over a decade trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act entirely, with no plan to replace it. When they haven't been able to repeal it wholesale, Republicans have looked for ways to attack and weaken the Affordable Care Act from the inside out. And this is just what the administration did with this rule. They are chipping away at the Affordable Care Act and taking away health care from Wisconsin families. While President Trump works out his concept of a plan, Republicans still have no real proposal on health care. Even if they could repeal the Affordable Care Act, they have nothing to protect the 24 million Americans who got coverage on healthcare.gov from being simply kicked off their insurance. Concepts of a plan simply are not good enough for the people that I represent. They deserve better. In fact, they need some breathing room and lower costs. Instead of meeting families where they are and lowering costs, Republicans are taking us in the wrong direction. At the start of this year, 22 million Americans saw their premiums go up in 2026 because Republicans refused to extend tax breaks to help families afford their health care. And behind every one of those 22 million Americans is a story. A family forced to make impossible choices about finances, their health, and their future. I'm talking about folks like Nancy and John from Park Falls, Wisconsin, whose premiums were set to increase by over $2,000 each month in 2026. Nancy wrote to me, "This is absolutely unaffordable. Literally, we cannot pay this. We would have to sell our home and our vehicles in order to just come up with the money to do that." Another constituent from Barron County, Wisconsin, wrote to me sharing that without the tax breaks, he would have to spend over 40%, get that, 40% of his income on health insurance alone just to ensure his wife could continue to get her treatment for her breast cancer. I also heard from Eric and his wife in Menominee, Wisconsin. They both retired from teaching after 30 years and are still not yet eligible for Medicare. He wrote to me that they were seriously considering going without any health insurance since paying close to $3,000 a month on a fixed income might just break the bank. Republicans ran out the clock on helping families like these, and the final window to get coverage for this year ends in just 2 days, on January 15th. How many Americans like Eric or Nancy are being forced to give up their health insurance this year? And how many more will consider selling their houses or their car just to make sure that they can afford sometimes life-saving care? And now, on top of this, the Trump administration is pushing a rule to kick even more families off of their health care. The rule we're talking about today would shorten the open enrollment periods and introduce much more red tape, locking eligible families out of getting their health insurance. We should be making it easier, not harder, for Americans to see a doctor. We should be making health care more affordable, not more expensive. Over the past year, I've talked to countless constituents who are sick and tired of Republicans' constant attacks on their health care. Instead of spending time coming up with new ways to kick Americans off Affordable Care Act plans, I urge my Republican colleagues to help us reverse this disastrous rule and actually start working with us to fix our broken health care system. I yield.
From Alabama.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to complete my remarks prior to the scheduled recess.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, for months, I've been raising the alarm over radical Islam infiltrating the greatest country on the face of the earth, the United States of America. You know, some Americans see what's happening in Europe, and they think, you know, would that ever happen in our country? The reality is, yes, it's happening right now, right before our very eyes. The enemy is now inside the gates. There are plenty of Muslims that come here, love this country, assimilate into American culture, and they have a duty to join in the fight and speak out against the mainstream media and elected officials who are empowering radical Islam to take a foothold in the United States of America. Governor Kathy Hochul of New York welcomed in the new year by declaring January as Muslim American Heritage Month. And to red-blooded American patriots' dismay, Hochul directed state landmarks, including the iconic skyline of New York City, to be lit in the color of Islamic green. You know, what makes the situation, Mr. President, even worse is that the One World Trade Center was also lit up in the Islamic green, as you see here, the exact location where Islamic terrorists flew planes into the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001, killing thousands of innocent Americans. You know, this was a slap in the face of the families of nearly 3,000 victims who were murdered and thousands injured on that very, very tragic day. You know, I never thought I'd see something like this in my lifetime. But for years, the radical left, the globalists, and the deep state have colluded to destroy this country and have found a way to flood our communities with third world Muslims whose only goal is not to assimilate, but to destroy the West and create a worldwide caliphate. You know, if you don't understand what that looks like, just take a look at Europe. Under Barack Obama and Joe Biden, our federal government imported millions of foreigners who hate America, enabling them to live on welfare and forcing American taxpayers to pay the bills. New York City's recent mayoral election reveals how easily a Muslim communist can come to power in our nation's most iconic city. You know, foreign-born communist Mayor Zohran Mamdani polled 62% of support from foreign-born voters in New York. weren't born in the state of New York, weren't born in our country, but 62% of them supported him. Only 30% of American-born voters voted for him. Under Joe Biden, millions of illegal aliens, including terrorists, murderers, and rapists, were planted there to completely destroy the freedom-loving voter base, all on purpose. As a result, a foreign-born Muslim communist who hates the greatest nation on earth and wants to change it is now in power. During his inaugural ceremony, Kami McDami used 2 Korans for his swearing-in ceremony, not the Bible. He used a book that advocates for killing of all who don't believe in Islam or refuse to follow Islamic teachings. He was also sworn in at an abandoned subway, a subway station symbolizing what New York City will soon look like when freedom-loving Americans flee for their lives and Sharia law becomes the rule of law in the 5 boroughs in New York City. New York City, the symbol of liberty and freedom in the new world, is now turning into the same oppressive hellhole freedom-loving immigrants have fled from for centuries. They've been running from it. But now we're changing into that same situation. The deep state hasn't wasted any time in 2026 to accelerate its globalist agenda to destroy this country. And if we don't do something to stop this Islamic takeover of our country, we will soon be called the United Caliphate of America. That means Christians, Jews, and anyone else who doesn't convert to Islam will be prosecuted and persecuted. It'll be acceptable for young girls and women to be raped, and Islamic terrorism and violence will become the norm. Thankfully, President Trump and his administration is working day and night to save this country through mass deportation, revoking immigrant visas, and implementing travel bans in majority Muslim countries who support this radical Islam crowds who chant death to America. We continue to see more evidence that comes out of Muslim third world foreigners defrauding American people of their hard-earned taxpayer dollars. You know, thanks to independent journalist Nick Shirley, more and more fraud from Somali immigrants in Minnesota who are pretending to use the money to feed children or help people with autism. It's being exposed every day now. In a recent hearing in the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, testimony from a Minnesota state representative claimed that U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson estimates that total amount of criminal fraud to this point, after 5 years, has reached $9 billion. That's billion with a B. But Minnesota's Attorney General said this weekend on CNN in an interview that, you know, the fraud estimation is not a serious thing. That's just political theater. That's expensive political theater. A statement like that is not only an insult to many Minnesotans, but it's also a slap in the face to the hardworking taxpayers of this country. What's taken place in Minnesota is pure evil, and it's straight from the pit of hell. It's impressive to me that a 23-year-old independent journalist did more to serve the American people with investigative reporting than the so-called experts in the legacy media. Where are they? The fake news is complicit with the radical Islamic takeover of the United States, and they are in on the scam on the American taxpayers. Thanks to Nick Shirley's efforts, more fraud is being exposed in other states. Fox News recently reported that Somalia's permanent representative of the United Nations, representative to the United Nations, now serving as president of the UN Security Council, is linked to an Ohio home health care agency that has previously been punished for its ties to massive fraud. There are other reports surfacing about Somalia's foreign affairs running a health care company in Toledo, Ohio, who has a business partner that works for a Somalian money transfer service which has been accused of financing Islamic terrorism. You can't make this up. It goes on and on. So here's more. For months, a new publication in the state of Maine, known as the Maine Wire, reported on a similar event taking place in Lewiston, Maine, also known today as Little Mogadishu. Gateway Community Services, founded by a Somalian refugee, received $28.8 million in Maine care payments between 2019 and 2024, $28 million. And last year, a whistleblower came forward alleging that the organization systematically defrauded the Maine Care program for the last 5 years. Thanks to the hard work of the Trump administration, funding has stopped and the organization is under severe investigation. As more of this comes to light, a couple facts are becoming more and more apparent. Number one, third world foreigners from predominantly Muslim countries are coming here and stealing American tax dollars while they spew anti-American rhetoric. Number two, Democratic elected officials seem to be complicit in helping foreigners who hate this country steal from their own constituency, the own people that vote for them. The enemies of our country are robbing American citizens in broad daylight. While the cost of living standards in our country skyrocket, higher than they should be, healthcare premiums go up year after year, that should make every single American's blood boil. But Democrats have invited terrorists from countries that hate us. They steal our benefits. They enjoy our schools, overrun our hospitals, vote in our elections, and then steal our tax dollars and send them back to the country they came from where they can fund terrorism. Thankfully, we have a president who loves this country and is going to change it. President Trump and his administration are working around the clock to halt immigration, to stop fraudulent schemes that were allowed to take place under Joe Biden. Patriotic Americans are thankful for the work of DHS and ICE and what they're doing to clean up our streets at a cost. DHS and ICE agents have been targeted by radicals because they're enforcing the law. What a thought. And I will continue to support law enforcement until every single illegal is out of this country and comes here the right way. If you're going to interfere in law enforcement's ability to do their jobs, folks, in any way, don't be surprised if you're arrested and thrown into jail, and you should be. Thanks to investigative reporters like Nick Shirley and folks at the Maine Wire, we're slowly turning the tide on fraud and corruption. Deep state and fake news media, third world Islamists, they are eroding our country from within. We need to wake up. American citizens need to come together, recognize what's going on, and say enough's enough. As long as I'm alive, I will fight to ensure that my granddaughter, Rosie Grace, can grow up in the same country that I and a lot of other people had a chance to grow up in, greatest country on the face of the earth. And what I'm telling people across this country, and what should have happened in Europe years ago, folks, wake up. They're here. The enemy is inside the gate. We're in bad trouble. And if we don't stop it, we will lose this country that has been built for 250 years. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.